If you don't know the case I'm bringing you today, I think you're going to be very surprised, just like I was when I found out about it, because it's absolutely crazy. Sometimes I find myself watching my neighbors and wondering, could any one of them be hiding a really dark secret? I'm not saying we should be afraid of everyone, but when you hear stories like today's about a guy who everyone said was a great husband, a great father, and a model neighbor, it makes you think that anyone could be living right next to a monster right now. Today we're covering the case of the monster of Denver, Chris Watts. It was the early hours of August 13th, 2018. Shanann Watts was getting out of a car driven by her friend Nicole Atkinson. The two of them had been on a work trip and were coming back from the airport. Shanann was a saleswoman for a pyramid scheme company called Level, and she was positioned as one of the best in the company, which meant she traveled to other states to promote their products. And Shanann was one of the best sellers in the company. This trip she had taken to Arizona was just one of many she had to make for work. She was 15 weeks pregnant. They were expecting the family's first boy. She and her husband, Chris Watts, already had two little girls, Bella, 4 years old, and Celeste Catherine, 3 years old. Chris, for his part, worked at an oil company called Anadarko Petroleum. On that early morning, on the way home from the airport, her friend Nicole had noticed that Shanann wasn't quite feeling right and thought she might be having complications with her pregnancy. So she told her that the next day she'd come pick her up so they could go to the doctor together and make sure everything was okay.
The next day, after sending messages and trying to call with no response at all, Nicole reached out to Chris to ask what had happened with Shanann. Chris said he hadn't received any responses from her either all morning, and that all he knew was that Shanann had mentioned going to a friend's house with the girls. Nicole was Shanann's best friend. She knew when something didn't make sense. Since she hadn't gotten any response from Shanann all morning and they were supposed to go to the doctor, she decided to go to the house to see if something had happened to her. After all, Shanann hadn't been feeling well the day before, and on top of that, Shanann had diabetes and lupus. Nicole thought she might have lost consciousness. When she got no response ringing the doorbell, she went to the medical center just in case Shanann had gone there in an emergency without her. When she arrived, they told her Shanann had not shown up for her scheduled appointment. She called Chris again to tell him to call the police, that maybe his wife was in the house and had passed out. Chris told her not to call the police and that he'd be there in a few minutes to go see what was going on. According to Nicole's account, she also called family members and other friends, everyone who knew Shanann, and nobody had seen her. Another strange thing was this. As we said, Shanann worked for a multi-level marketing company and had the flexibility to work from home. She used social media literally like a reality show. She posted everything, not just about her products, but also about her thoughts, her entire life, her personal things. And it wasn't just one post a day, it was several. From what I read, this was a strategy she used so that her buyers would end up feeling like they were her friends, which made her sell a lot more. There's a reason she was one of the company's top sellers. And that day, she had posted absolutely nothing. A person who at least posted a good morning to her followers every single morning had posted absolutely nothing. That's when Nicole decided to call the police. Even though the police and Shanann's friend Nicole both expected to find her inside the house, Chris's behavior was very strange, completely unbothered by a call in which a police officer himself was alerting him that his wife might be in trouble inside their home. Shanann's car was in the garage, and the shoes she always wore were visible through a window next to the front door. Let's analyze the behavior for a moment. If someone tells me that a person might be in trouble and I'm at my office or far away, I say, break the door down and get in. But not Chris. He forbade the authorities from breaking down the door and told them he'd be there in a few minutes to open it himself. Nicole had tried to get into the house herself because she had the entry code. In the US, many homes have a security system with a code. You enter the code and the door unlocks. Nicole had that code, and she entered it, but the door had an internal chain lock, the kind that lets you beep in the door a little bit but makes it impossible to actually get in. The strange thing about all of this was that the entire house was locked up, but that chain lock can only be put on from the inside. And then there was everything else Nicole knew about Shanann's behavior. 1, she never went anywhere without her phone. 2, the shoes she wore every day were sitting right there in plain sight. 3, the car was also in the garage. 4, there had been no posts on her social media all day. Obviously, everyone was still assuming she was unconscious somewhere inside the house.
From the outside, they looked like the classic American couple with a perfect family and a model life. All their friends and acquaintances described them almost with envy. They seemed so perfect. But nothing could have been further from the truth. At this point, the story of Chris Watts was beginning to unravel in front of the police body cameras. In the U.S., officers are required by law to wear a body camera that must record everything during investigations, responding to locations, or 911 calls. And Chris had already started giving hints about what might have happened to his family according to his version of events. His story suggested that Shanann had run off with the girls, possibly due to the stress of the divorce, according to Chris. But then something happened. A neighbor mentioned he had a camera pointed toward his own garage that also captured the Watts' garage, and that maybe they could see the exact moment Shanann had left with the girls, if Chris's theory were true. But what they saw was something totally different. Shanann had shared the first images of her pregnancy on Facebook with the caption, "Chris is the best dad we could ever ask for." And listening to Chris on camera, "I just want them back," what you're hearing is called emotional detachment, and it tends to be a behavior of people who are hiding something or who are guilty. In this example, Chris says the girls instead of my daughters. Emotional detachment. I had seen a video on YouTube by a psychologist who explained that when someone bites their lip while they're guilty, it's because they're trying to stop themselves from smiling. It's because they feel like everyone believes them and they can't help feeling pleased, feeling superior to everyone else. It's an unconscious act. It's not that they're doing it on purpose, but it's an unconscious act that can be seen in many cases involving guilty people. 4 hours after his media interviews, the interrogation began. In this first phase, investigators try to learn a bit more about the events while already forming a profile of their suspect, in this case, Chris Watts, because he was the last person to see Shanann before she disappeared. And the story started to take shape. According to Chris, Shanann arrived home from her trip at around 2 in the morning and went to sleep. At 4, Chris woke Shanann up and they started arguing about the divorce. They fought but then went back to sleep and he started getting ready for work. According to the security cameras, Chris left at 5:30 in the morning. After leaving, he claimed his wife and daughters were still sleeping. That was the last time he saw them. Obviously, the investigators had much more information about everything that had happened, but they were watching how Chris behaved with the questions they were asking him. At this point, the investigators already knew that Chris had a lover, named Nicole Kessinger. On June 15, 2018, that was the first time Chris had saved Nicole Kessinger, his co-worker, as a contact in his phone. By the time of the interview, the investigators had already gathered information and even interviewed Nicole about the secret relationship they were having. In other words, they already knew all of this when they asked Chris about the infidelity. In the interview they conducted with Nicole, she admitted that she initially didn't know Chris was married with children, but that before Father's Day, Chris had told her about his relationship with Shanann, about his daughters, and that they were in the process of getting a divorce. This is where things get strange in the Kessinger case. In addition to interrogating her, investigators also analyzed her work computer, and there they found some Google searches. For example, she Googled wedding dresses. For over 2 hours she browsed. She also searched Chris and Shanann Watts' Facebook pages. She also searched phrases like, "I'm having a relationship with a married man who said he was going to leave his wife." Another phrase she searched was lovers who get married. The last search she made on Google was for wedding dresses, and it was made just 9 days before Shanann disappeared. In her interrogation, Kessinger said she was not involved in anything, and apparently there was no evidence that she knew anything about the disappearance, but it was still pretty suspicious. During those last 2 months before the disappearance of Shanann and her daughters, Nicole Kessinger and Chris had seen each other on several occasions. Shanann had traveled to North Carolina for 5 weeks of vacation with her daughters, while her husband stayed in Colorado to work. He used those 5 weeks to be with Kessinger. They went to bars together, and on the 4th of July, Kessinger visited the Watts house for the first time. In addition, on Chris's phone, investigators found private photos that Kessinger had sent him. She was in her underwear. Then came the polygraph test. In the second interrogation, Chris Watts was so self-centered that he genuinely thought he could pass a lie detector test. And guess what? Chris Watts failed on almost every question. Some of them were, do you know where your wife and daughters are? And do you have anything to do with this disappearance? Now, a polygraph or lie detector test is not sufficient evidence to convict a person because it measures anxiety levels, which can be influenced by many factors and don't definitively establish guilt. But it is useful for trying to extract a confession after the results are shared with the alleged suspect. After Chris failed the lie detector test, pressure from the investigators increased. The first thing he confessed was that yes, he did have a lover, something he had denied in the first interrogation, but he kept saying he had nothing to do with his family's disappearance. Then, Chris Watts claimed that he killed his wife after seeing her kill their daughters. He then drove the bodies to the oil company where he worked, submerged his daughters' bodies in oil tanks, each one in a separate tank, and buried his pregnant wife a few meters away. The confession was enough to bring him to trial, although investigators knew the story wasn't exactly as he told it. He murdered his wife and daughters because he wanted to start a new life with his lover, Nico Kessinger. Was Nico involved in this murder? Was she the one who encouraged Chris to kill his entire family? It's a theory, but it was never proven in court. The guilt led Chris to plead guilty to all 4 murders: his wife, his 2 daughters, and his unborn son. In Colorado, this crime can carry the maximum penalty, which is the death penalty. But his family, as well as Shanann's family, decided they would request a life sentence instead, because they didn't want any more people dead as a result of this tragedy. Chris Watts was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. What I truly cannot wrap my head around with cases like this is why. In this case, he killed his entire family to be with his lover. How does it make sense in anyone's mind to kill your 2 daughters and your wife? The solution is simple. You get a divorce and move on. The reason for this murder was never officially established. The idea that the murder was to start a new life is a police theory, but it was never officially confessed by Chris. He only confessed to the murders, not to the motive. And whether his lover, Nico Kessinger, had anything to do with it, we'll probably never know.